Here is Colorverse Ginkgo Tree. This is a beautiful golden orange, very much like a sunset orange. I can't go any further without mentioning that I had a bunch of flow issues, having to reprime the pen frequently. The tone and the shading do hold steady as paper changes. And on non-fountain pen friendly paper, this ink is full on berserker rage. Wolverine would be proud of it. So don't use this on non-fountain pen friendly papers. The aggressiveness and the combination with the flow issues make this a hard pass for me, despite this great color.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. So now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we get to really see and enjoy that beautiful golden orange kind of sunset on this bright white Clairefontaine paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade incredibly well. It truly looks great. I do wish we saw a little bit more of this full range of the shading like we see with subscript here on the second line, though most of what's going to happen is like what we see with notation on the third line. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Permanent Navy Blue. Here is Colorverse Space Laka. Here is Colorverse Walk the Dog. Here is Colorverse Deep Purple.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see we have the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairefontaine. Truly looking fantastic on the paper all the time. Loving this tone in what we're getting. Looking at the back of the page, there's no ghosting, but there's plenty of spots that it did bleed through, touching the page underneath. So if it gets deep into the paper, it's going to pepper the page underneath with little spots of color.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. It does not shift in tone because of the paper, meaning this ink is opaque. Looking at the back of the page, we see that it does get quite deep into the paper very frequently. The ghosting's not out of control. What is out of control is all of these bleeding spots. It really created a massacre scene in the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we have the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade nearly as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, though it does still shade. Not uncommon to see words like this with almost no shading, like finite on the third line. However, I do see this standing out against the quad rule without any kind of problem. Looking at the back of the page, while ghosting is not a problem, there are a couple of spots we can find that it got deeper into the page. Now, it never bled through touching the page underneath, but this is a coated paper that it's getting very deep into. I don't know how well those spots showed up on camera before I circled them.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more orange inks.
Here is Three Oysters Hang Toe. Here is Bookbinder's Everglades Rat Snake. Here is Califolio Anahuac. Here is Elixir Siloso Sunset.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, flatter as well, which is normal for this paper. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade almost as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem. And if you are a student using this, you have a very interesting color on the page. This is a good choice for a student using these lab notebooks. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, further cementing the usefulness of these notebooks for students.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Diamine Denim. Here is Roher & Klinger Sepia. Here is Diatramentis Document Grain. Here is Krishna Orchid Lily. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does have a little bit of spread, which is normal for copy paper. It does have some shading, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It is interesting. It is a good alternative to red if you're using that for grading on this or for adding a second color on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see it really gets deep into the paper quite frequently. Now, it never bled through touching the page on the other side, which really shows that while this is the lowest quality of paper that Hammermill makes, this tends to handle fountain pen ink very well. I was expecting a lot of bleed through here. Now, I would never use both sides of the page with this ink because of how deep it gets into there.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Noodler's Nib Creeper is a wet pen and had flow issues with this ink. Bear in mind that they have ebonite feeds, and usually ebonite feeds are going to have a little bit better ink flow and control. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium, and not surprisingly, it still had flow issues. That was the major thing I was coming up with. Put this ink into a pen of someone that you really feel like frustrating somebody that you want to interrupt their writing to make them constantly prime that pen. Or if you enjoy being frustrated, then enjoy it yourself. Just don't put this in my pen ever again.